Okay, good morning, everyone. Today's Daf Yomi is Chagigah Daf Yotes, Chagigah 18. And today's Daf Yomi, we were discussing yesterday the idea of how we know that the Shavuos has what's called the Tashlumin, that you can make up for the Tashlumin for Shavuos for 7 days. Means to say, if you didn't bring the pilgrimage offering on the first day on the holiday, or according to Beis Shammai, you're not even allowed to bring on the holiday, on the first day. So then you have 7 days to make it up. And the Gemara had brought down these positions, and the upshot of those positions was that it's very clear that you're not allowed to work on Chol Moed. And indeed, Reish Lakish on the top of 18a, which is where we'll start, 2 lines to the top, also makes this point. So Reish Lakish is going to try and prove, how do we know that Shavuos, that if you don't bring the pilgrimage offering on the first day of Shavuos, that you have Tashlumin for that you can make it up. So the Gemara says that the point comes from here. Reish Lakish says, V'chaga katzir. It says about the holiday of Shavuos, it's the holiday of the harvest. So Ezu Chag Shata. Oh, and I'm going to mention that all the Torah study today, this week, is sponsored by Jill Sachs in memory of her father of blessed memory. So we're very appreciative to Jill Sachs. And hold on, let me just say his name. Hold on one second. Chaim Feivel ben Baruch Shimon v'Chaya Etta. So we're studying today in memory of Chaim Feivel ben Baruch Shimon v'Chaya Etta. So, okay, so Reish Lakish says, what's the proof? It says V'chaga Katzir, it's the holiday of the harvest. So what is a holiday? Shata chogeg v'kotzer. But what's a holiday that you're allowed to celebrate it and also harvest? Have Omer Zoatzeres. This is Shavuos. So Shavuos, you're allowed to celebrate the holiday and also harvest it. So the Gemara says, Amos, when? You Ema be Yom Tov. If you want to say it's on the holiday of Yom Tov, if you want to say you're allowed to celebrate it on the holiday of the Yom Tov, Ktsira be Yom Tov Mishari. That are you allowed to harvest on a Yom Tov? You're not allowed to harvest. It's a prohibition to harvest on a Yom Tov. So it must be, says Reish Lakish, Elav with Tashlumin. It must be that this is to make up, in case you didn't bring it on the first day, that you have subsequent days to make up for the pilgrimage offering. So it says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't like Reish Lakish's attempted proof, because he says, El Me'ata, if you're going to say Chaga Katzir, means that you're allowed to harvest on the holiday. Chagah Asif, are you allowed to harvest on this is the holiday of the ingathering. That refers to the holiday that we call Sukkot, colloquially. Ezu Chag sheyesh bo asifa. There's no holiday where you're allowed to gather in your crops. Have Omer must be Zeh Chaga Sukkos. But Amos, but when are you gathering in the crops on Sukkos? Ilay must be Yom Tov. If you want to say it's on the holiday of Yom Tov, Milacha be Yom Tov, Mishari. You're not allowed to do the ingathering of your crops on Yom Tov. It's not permitted. So it must be El B'chol Shamoid. It must be on Chol Moed. Chol Shamoed Mishar. You're not allowed to do work on Chol Moed. So it must be El Chaga Babizman Asifa. So Reish Lakish says it doesn't mean the holiday where you gather the crops. It means the holiday that comes during the time of the gathering of the crops. And Achinami Chaga Babizman Katzira. This is also the holiday that comes during the time of the harvesting. So Rabbi Yochanan rejects Reish Lakish's proof, but the upshot of what Rabbi Yochanan says is that both he and Reish Lakish agree because the Travail Sfiruhu. The Chol Shamoed Aser Basiyas Malacha. Both he and Reish Lakish both agree that Chol Moed is prohibited to do work, because Reish Lakish says you're not allowed to do. Rabbi Yochanan says you're not allowed to do the gathering of the crops, and Reish Lakish is not arguing with him on that point that you're not allowed to gather the crops on Chol Moed. So we see on the intermediary days of the holiday, you're not allowed to do work on Chol Moed. You're not allowed to do the normal farming. So if that's the case, so how do they know that? From where do we learn this concept? This very important concept. From where do we learn this very important concept that you're not allowed to do work on Chol Moed? So that's what the Gemara asks. Yeah, sure, of course.
Why do you think this was not put in some tangent? Why do you think this was not put into Moed Katan?
That's a very good question. Bill is asking an excellent question. Why is this not put into Moed Katan? The first Rashi on in Moed Katan talks about how do we know that work is prohibited on Chol Moed, and also Tosfos here talks about a very, very important Tosfos talks about why is Chol Moed prohibited to do work. But it's a good question. Why is this here and not in Moed Katan? I don't have an answer for that, but I don't have an answer. Why it's not in Moed Katan. I don't have an answer. could think about it. We can look. I'm sure other people talk about it, but I just don't know. It's a very simple, basic question. There's a few tractates where the main idea is not in that tractate. That's what makes the Gemara so interesting and also so frustrating sometimes, that you're talking about something, but you don't go in a linear fashion, and it's not the way like we would organize things if we were going to organize it today. But because it was always like a stream of consciousness and some editing and there's a whole thing. So the Gemara says, so what's our source for the idea that you know how to work on Chol Moed? The Tanur Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Es Chag HaMatzos Tishmor Shivas Yamim. You shall watch the holiday of Matzos for 7 days. It says you shall watch the holiday of Matzos, of Pesach, for 7 days. This teaches us about Chol Moed, that you're not allowed to do work. That's the position of Rabbi Yoshaya. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan Omer, he says, no, you don't need that verse, because it's 7 days. It's not 7 days. We know it's only one day and the last day. So it's from the fact that it says Tishmor means you don't do work on Chol Moed. Rabbi Yonasan says, no, we don't learn it out from that verse. We learn it out from a Kal V'chomer. You don't need a verse. You have a logical argument. By the way, what's the difference if it's a verse where you say Tishmor? Tishmor implies a negative prohibition. If you violate it, theoretically, you get lashes. Whereas a Kal V'chomer, which is a logical argument, we have a concept throughout the Talmud, Ein Onshim Min Adin. We don't give you a punishment from a Kal V'chomer. So that's difference right there between how we derive it. So Rabbi Yonasan says, Ein Otzarach, it's a Kal V'chomer. Ma Rishon V'Shvi, just like day 1 and day 7, Shein Kedusha Lefneinu Achrein Asur B'Asiyas Melacha, the day prior to it and day after, day 1 and day 7 are not prohibited to do work. But those days themselves are prohibited. They are Asur B'Asiyas Melacha, meaning day 1 and day 7 of the holiday. Prior to it and after it, you're allowed to do work, but those days themselves you can't do work. Chol Shemoed, B'Chol Moed, Sheish Kedusha Lefneinu Acharein, Chol Moed, intermediary days, or before it and after it is holy. For sure, it should be prohibited to do work on those days. Gemara says this is a twisted logic, kind of, because the Gemara says the 6 days of creation can disprove that theory, because how can the 6 days of creation disprove that theory? Because the 6 days of creation are always surrounded by a Shabbos. The 6 days of the week is always surrounded by a Shabbos. And yet they are going to be permitted to do work. So therefore, we see that even though there's a holy day before and afterwards, it doesn't mean that the days in between you can't do work. So the Gemara says, well, the Gemara says, yeah, there's a fundamental difference between the 6 days of creation and Chol Moed. Chol Moed is holy because you bring the Karban Musaf. So maybe that's the idea that you can't do work. So Tomar B'Chol Shamoed Sheyesh Karban Musaf. So maybe in Chol Moed you can't do work because there's a Karban Musaf. You have an additional offering. So the Gemara says, well, that's not a good proof, because Rosh Chodesh Yochiach Sheyesh Karban Musaf Umutar V'Asiyas Malacha. Rosh Chodesh can disprove that. Rosh Chodesh, you have a Karban Musaf, and yet you're allowed to do work on Rosh Chodesh. Actually, women, the practice is not to do work, but the Gemara is just saying from the Iker Adin, from the main law, that you're allowed to do work on Rosh Chodesh. Gemara says, yeah, Rosh Chodesh is different than Chol Moed. There's a distinction. Ma Rosh Chodesh she'ein karoi mikra kodesh. Rosh Chodesh is not called a holy day by the Torah. Tomar B'Chol Shamoed she'karoi mikra kodesh. It has this term associated with it called mikra kodesh. So therefore, Rosh Chodesh cannot be compared to Chol Moed. Gemara says, Holva and Holva Kara Mikra Kodesh, and since Chol Moed is called Mikra Kodesh, Dinu Sha'asur B'Asiyas Malacha. Therefore, it makes sense it should be prohibited to do work. Gemara says, Tanya Yidach, alternative brisa states, Kol Malachas Avoda Lo Sasu. There's another source. The verse says all the work on the festival you shall not do. We made a Chol Shamoed Sha'asur B'Asiyas Malacha. Since it says all your work, this comes to include Chol Moed, that you're not allowed to do work. That's the position of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So now we've seen three proofs right here. One is Chag HaMatzos Tishmor. One is this Kal V'chomer, it's logical argument. And now we see Kol Malachas Avodah Lo Sasu. Now, fourth proof, Rabbi Kiva says Ein Otzarach. You have another idea. Harei Omer, it says Elo Moadei Hashem. It says these are the festivals of God that Asher Tikru Osem B'Moadam. But what's it referring to? In Bereshit, if it's referring to day 1, Arei Kvar Nemar, there's another verse which said right before it in verse, it states in Vayikra Chav Gimel Pasuk Lamed Tes. It says in that verse, Shabbaton. It already calls it a Shabbaton. It says, Shavas Yamim Bayom Rishon Shabbaton Yom Hashmini Shabbaton. So it can't be referring to the holiday itself. So therefore, what's it referring to? In Bishvi, Erik Var Nemar Shabbaton. Also about the seventh day, it says Shabbaton. Or really, in that verse, it says in Bishmini. So what's it referring to? So the Torah is referring to the intermediary days which you have to keep holy. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. Ela Moadei Hashem. To teach you that you're not allowed to do work. So that's proof number 4. Now we come to proof number 5. Tanya Idach, an alternative source. The Gemara doesn't immediately say who's doing this. It says 6 days you shall eat the matzos. And on day 7 is Ashteres. Ma'ashvi, just like the 7th day is Atzur, you can't do work. Also the 6 days you can't do work. So that teaches us you can't do work on Chol Moed. But if on day 6 you can't do any work, maybe even on these previous 6 days you can't do any work at all. But then the verse 6 specifies the 7th day you can't do work. So how do we do that? What does that mean? So it comes to teach us. Day 7 you can't do any work, but the other days, they say the 6 days, but it really means the 5 previous days, or if it's Shmini Atzeres, the previous 6 days, then you can't do any work. So which so this is Rashi cites this in the first Daf Yomi, if you remember. He says so this prohibition was given over to the sages to tell you the sages are the ones to tell you what day is prohibited and what day is permitted. And what work is prohibited and what work is permitted. So we see from here, according to this 5th one, which is the one that Rashi cites in Gemara and Moed Katan, it's a biblical prohibition, but the Torah gave over to the rabbis to define the parameters of that prohibition. Tosfos rejects this idea. It's we're not going to read the entire Tosfos, but I just want to say the first line. The Tosfos says at first glance you might think that it is a biblical prohibition to work on Chol Moed because they have all these verses, but the Kasha Rabbeinu Tam, Tosfos says rejects this. Rabbeinu Tam, the lion of the Tosfos, rejects this because we know that you're going to allow certain things because if you're gonna, there's 5 major categories where you can do work on Chol Moed, and Tosfos lists some of them. Like for example, if it's something you're going to lose money, or certain types of work, or if you're a worker and you're not going to have any money, or if it's for the needs of the community. So how could it be that we are just going to be so lenient then? So Tosfos therefore says it's not biblical, but it is rabbinic, and that's the Tosfos is. That's Tosfos' approach to this. So now we're saying we said in our Mishnah that if the day of the slaughter of the animals of the Shavuos was on a Sunday because you couldn't slaughter it on the first day, which was Shabbos, or according to Beis Shammai, even on a Friday. So then you slaughter it on a Sunday, but that day, even though it's a holiday because you're slaughtering the animals for the sacrifices, on that day you're allowed to do work to undermine the position of the Sadducees who said you can't do work who said that day is always Shavuos, because the Sadducees said Sunday was always the Shavuos day. So we want to undermine their position. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara tells us a story about that. Right? So there was an incident to Mace Alexa. Alexa died Belud. So and everybody came in to eulogize Alexa. Rabbi Tarfon said, no, we're not going to allow it. So, because it's the holiday of Shavuos, they said. Well, Gemara says, Yom Tov Salchadaitach. If it was Yom Tov, nobody could come. So nobody could come on Yom Tov. So he said he didn't let them come. Rabbi Tarfon didn't let them come. Rabbi Tarfon lived after the destruction of the temple. He didn't let them come because it was the Yom Tavuach. It was the day of the slaughter. And so therefore, since it was the day of the slaughter, he didn't allow them to come. So this is a contradiction, because we just said on the day of the slaughter in our Mishnah, you said you're allowed to eulogize. So it's to undermine the Sadducees. And here, Rabbi Tarfon said, don't mourn for Alexa. So Gemara says, so it depends when the Yom Tavuach was. If the Yom Tavuach was during the week, then Rabbi Tarfon said you can't eulogize. But if it was on a Sunday, then you have to eulogize to undermine the Sadducees. And now we go to the top of 18b. So the 18b, we now start the second part of the tractate, which really deals with all of the laws of Tuma, Tahara, of ritual purity and impurity. But and at first glance, you might think this is completely irrelevant to our lives today, but it really is all about cross-mingling of communities and how the rabbis dealt with their purity level and how they interacted with their neighbors and brothers and sisters who did not observe the same level of religious purity laws that they did. And so therefore it's extraordinarily interesting and relevant for us as we all navigate these issues in our own lives today. And also it has a lot of relevance for how people separated from each other during COVID and the level of separation that's required. So really there's a lot of laws to in order to really understand this properly. I want to highly recommend you read the introduction to the art scroll to this topic, because they have a very good introduction, excellent as usual. So I want to recommend people read that.
In this volume?
Yeah, they introduced it at the very beginning of the volume of Chagigah, and also before this section they also introduce it. But I'll try to explain it as we go along. So there are different levels of tumah. Let me just say this as a background, that there's the highest level of ritual impurity is somebody touches a dead body. A dead body is an aviyah avosa tumah, the primary source of the tumah. But if somebody touches that, they become what's called an ava tumah, a primary source of tumah. And then a person can become. Then we can transmit that tumah to different levels of categories of food and drink. It's what's called a rishon tumah, first degree tumah, a second degree tumah. If the food touches another food item, that makes it a second degree tumah, and a third degree tumah, and a fourth degree tumah. But now biblically speaking, there's really no such thing as third degree tumah, second degree tumah, fourth degree tumah, first degree level of tumah. However, the rabbis put in these stringencies, but the idea that something can become a third degree tumah only applies to truma, which is the food that the kohanim could eat, and the fourth degree tumah only applies to kodshim, which is the sacrificial food brought in the temple. So something is called tameh. It's able to make something else tameh, but if it's pasul, then or posel, then it stops at that point. So these are some ideas. So the Talmud says, Notlin, we're going to start with the Mishnah. Notlin liyadayim l'chulin or meiser or truma or Notlin yadayim l'chulin or meiser or truma. So if a person would want to wash their hands, because their hands, we'll see, have a concept that the hands are a second degree level of tumah. And so so because they're not going to be considered to have washed your hands properly, and so even though you don't know if they're ritually impure, you should wash your hands before eating the bread. And this is one of the reasons why we wash our hands today. At the Seder, you wash your hands before eating the bread of chulin, of non-sacred food, and also ua meiser. And also you need to wash your hands before eating the bread of what's called meiser sheni, which is the second tithe, which is food that needs to be eaten in Jerusalem, and also ua truma. And before eating the truma, which is the sacred food that the Kohen eats. And now the Talmud, first of all, what is this even doing here? Why are we even studying these laws about holidays? Because you're going to see at the very end of the tractate, and 8 days or so, that all of these laws, many of them were suspended during the holiday so that everyone could participate. They wanted to suspend these laws so everyone could participate. And so we gave people the benefit of the doubt because all these pilgrims, you wanted them to participate in the holiday. So the Talmud says, Ur Kodesh, and if you want to eat the sacred food, the Kodesh, the ritual temple food, so you want to eat the shlamim or the sin offerings, such a category, then even though you don't need know if your hands were tamei, you need to matbilin, you need to immerse them into a real mikvah. And there's another. So now the Talmud's going to say the other malos, the other stringencies that we did by kodshim, by the sacred food versus just the other food here. Uchatas, and by a sin offering, in nitnu yadav, nitma kol gufo. By a sin offering, if just your hands became tamei, we say actually your whole body is tamei, you need to immerse in the mikvah. Now the Talmud Mishnah is going to tell us that you need to have intent when you immerse in the mikvah. For you need, because part of the whole, one of the whole concepts here of this ritual purity is intentionality. So tava l'chulin, if a person immersed and he had in mind that he's immersing so that he could eat chulin, huchzak l'chulin. We say the immersion is valid for chulin, for regular food, but also a meiser. It's not going to be effective for meiser sheni. If he was tavo a meiser, if he immersed with the intent to be able to eat meiser sheni food, huchzak meiser. It's going to be valid for meiser sheni because meiser sheni was his intent. Va'aser l'truma, but it's not going to be valid for truma, which is even more sacred than meiser sheni. Tavo l'truma, v'huchzak l'truma. Tavo l'truma, huchzak l'truma. If he immersed for the truma, it's okay for truma, but aser l'kodesh. But it's not going to be good for kodshim, which is the highest level. Or tavo l'kodesh, huchzak l'kodesh. So the chatas is, I apologize for people who are joining now because I put out on the WhatsApp that we had to start this morning at 8:35. So I'm sorry for not getting it, but we're recording it and I can send people the recording. So I apologize. So if a person immersed for kodshim, it's going to, we're on the 18b, right? On 18b. If a person immersed for kodshim, it's going to be good for the mechatas, which is the sin offering of the red heifer, which is not eaten, but to deal with that. But tavo, so the basic principle is tavo chamar mutar l'kal. If you immerse for the most strict of these categories, i.e., it goes in descending order. First, the highest is the red heifer, then kodshim, the sacred food, then truma, the food for the kohen, then the meiser sheni, which is food that you would be able to eat in Jerusalem, and then the chulin. So then, if you immerse for the more strict one, mutar l'kal, it's okay for the lesser one. But taval v'lo huchzak, but if you immersed and you didn't have any intent whatsoever, it's like you didn't immerse at all. There's an exception to this. We say today, for example, with respect to a woman who didn't intend to immerse in the mikvah, she, let's say, just jumped into the ocean, that we would say, even though ideally she should have intent, that we would say is a valid immersion, even though there was no intent at all there. But that's a woman who's immersing to be with her husband. So big day Ha'aretz. So now we have another category, and you can see why this could be extraordinarily divisive. And the Talmud is going to talk about some of the divisiveness that came about as a result of these relationships. Let's say you have the garments of an Ha'aretz. Ha'aretz is a colloquial term for a person of the land. It means a person wasn't careful about these laws of ritual purity and impurity. Let's say you could think about it like there are some people who are very meticulous today about the laws of kosher. And now then you have somebody who's not careful. So that's how you can have these cross communities. So let's say you have the garments of an Ha'aretz. Today, we don't care about touching so much. But in those days, their touching was like our kosher. So you have the garments of an Ha'aretz, midras l'prushin. If somebody who was a parush, meaning somebody who was separate, he was one of the people who was careful about the laws of tum and tahara, if he carried their garments, somebody who was very careful to only eat his food in a state of ritual purity, then that person becomes an avatuma. We're going to say he's going to become a primary source of tuma because we have to be concerned that the Ha'aretz wasn't careful. Big day Prushin, somebody who's a parush, he's careful to eat in a state of ritual purity. His garments are midras l'ochle truma. He himself, his garments are going to be prohibited. They're going to make tummy. Somebody who's very careful to only eat in a state of to watch himself for truma. Big day l'ochle truma midras l'kodesh. And big day kodesh midrash l'chatas. Same idea that somebody who's careful only to watch himself with respect to kodesh, his garments are going to make tamei, the person who's guarding himself for kachim, and so too then mitatis mitanis for the one who watching himself for the offerings of the red heifer. The Mishnah then brings that with respect to these levels, we're not going to make it subjective. We don't give any breaks. Yosef ben Yoezer Yosef ben Yoezer was the pious among the Kohanim, and he was the president of the whole generation. And he was very careful not to eat to guard himself from ritual impurity because he was a Kohen, so he could eat the truma. But his handkerchief, if somebody who was guarding himself for kachim would pick it up, he would become tamei, because he was only guarding himself for truma. So too, Yochanan ben Gudgada hayochal taras hakodesh kol yomav hayisamit pachto midras lachatas. So Yochanan ben Gudgada, who was very careful to guard himself to eat kachim his whole life, he really kept didn't touch anybody who just ate truma. So you can imagine this guy's probably living in a bubble, but he wasn't good enough for the red heifers. But people are guarding themselves for the ashes of the red heifer. We learned already in a few places. We learned this in Yoma that the people who were raised for the red heifer, they were mamish on a bubble. They were placed on bedrock and raised above it, and that's where they live. All right, so the Gemara asked the question: Chulin and Meiser, mi bo netilas yadayim? Why do you have to wash your hands for Chulin and Meiser? You know why they don't need netilas yadayim? Why do you have to wash your hands for that? There are many. Didn't we learn? We have a contradictory source from the Mishnah and Bikurim where we learned that truma v'abikurim. This is truma, the food that's eaten by the Kohen, and the bikurim, which is the first fruits, which are also eaten by the Kohen. Chayav and olam misa. If somebody who's non-Kohen eats them, they get death from heaven. And if you eat them accidentally, and you also have to pay back the Kohen. If you ate them accidentally, you have to pay back the Kohen plus the chomesh. You have to add a fifth to the value that you pay back. Va'asar wazarim, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat them. Ve'hein nichsei Kohen, and they are going to be considered the property of the Kohen, meaning to say Truma and Bikurim, they're the property of the Kohen. So what? So what does that mean? So if the Kohen wants to betroth the wife, you have to give her something of value. So you could give her the kochim, you could give her the truma as a gift, and then she's considered betrothed. It's his to betroth with it. And if let's say a little piece of your truma falls into your chicken soup pot, then if it's 100 times, 101 times the value of it, then it's nullified. Meat and milk is 60 times. The truma is echad v'meya. So you need 101 times the total of it. And they require washing your hands before you eat the truma. And also, in addition to that, after you wash your hands, so if you don't wash your hands and then you touch them, you're not going to be able to eat them because they're going to be considered a shlishi. In addition to that, they are of shemesh, that if you were tamei and you immerse in the mikvah, you need to wait till nightfall before you can eat them. That's the first Mishnah in the whole Talmud. When is the time for Shema when the Kohanim could eat from the truma, and then we say Harei Elu b'truma bikurim Masha Ein Kim b'Meiser, and so we see from here the kol shekei mechulin, and so we see from here these laws are said by truma and bikurim, but they're not said by Meiser Sheni. So Meiser Sheni, you don't need to wash your hands. And certainly by Chulin, you wouldn't need to wash your hands if you don't need to wash your hands for Meiser Sheni. Because what's the concern that if you touch the food and your hands are a second degree level of Tumah, it can make it a third degree Tumah. But that doesn't apply to food that's not Truma. It doesn't apply to Meiser Sheni and Chulin. So the Gemara asks the question, Kasha, Meiser, Kasha, Chulin, Chulin. There's a contradiction between Meiser Sheni, and Chulin. Where it says Bishlam and Meiser will kasha, it's not a contradiction between Meiser Sheni. Why one source says you have to, our source says you have to wash your hands, and the other source says you don't. And the reason why it's not a contradiction is because Rabbi Meir, Harabanan. One is Rabbi Meir, one is Rabbanan. It's not called Tom Bios Mayim Midivrei Sofrim. Anything that you need to rabbinically. Anything that you need to purify yourself with water, because the sages say that it was tamei, then you're going to say it's like a sheni with tamam. The tamei is like kodesh. It makes the something's food. It makes it a third degree level of tumah to make kodesh, to make kachim tamei, and uposel as a truma, and it makes the truma itself tamei, but it can't. But that's where it stops. And it's permitted for chulin and meiser. That's Rabbi Meir's position. So Rabbi Meir would not require washing your hands for this. So the Chachamim say no, it could also make Meiser. So the Chachamim seem to say that there would be that there is third degree level of tumah by Meiser. But how do we explain why you need to wash your hands for chulin? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha kam ba'achil kam b'nekiya. If you want to eat it, you need to wash your hands. And whereas the Mishnah in Bikurim that says you don't need to wash your hands, that talks with respect to touching it. So Ma'askef Harashim Rashi, I can't go play Rabban Leder Omer El Ba'achil de Meiser, Avo b'nekiya de Meiser, Ba'achil de Chulin Lo Pligi. So Rav Shimon Barashi says, no, that doesn't make sense. The rabbis only argue with Rabbi Meir when it comes to eating the meiser, but with touching the meiser, they would allow you to do it, and so therefore you wouldn't need to wash your hands at all, even in our Mishnah here. And also with respect to eating chulin, they wouldn't say you need to wash your hands. The Gemara says no. Both sources refer to eating. One refers to eating the bread, and our Mishnah, which says you need to wash your hands, that refers to eating the bread, because most of the truma was really bread products, as opposed to fruits, which were not mostly the truma. And so for washing the hands for fruit, they didn't require it, and that's why it says Damar of Nachman Ko Anoto Yadav Leperos Harezem Igase Aruach. So that's why we only wash our hands for bread. But if you want to wash your hands for fruit, you're called arrogant. So we tell you not to do it. There's a lot more to talk about here, but we have to stop. And I'm sorry for those who joined late. I will just text me and I will send you a recording. I can send it to you in around an hour. Everybody have a great day. Yeshikoach.
Yeshikoach, Rabbi.
Take care.
Shakach.